The very first thing that you should do when learning a new skill is sit down and study the definitions of that specific skill. Let's say you want to learn how to invest in the stock market. You want to learn how to upholster, or you want to learn how to sew. Know the lingo so that when you go to watch videos, read books, maybe you have a mentor teaching you, it'll be so much easier for you to absorb the information. As you learn, you're going to be like, oh, I already know that term. Hello everyone, my name is Julianna Zinchenko and welcome to my fashion school. I am here to help you along your journey as a beginner in sewing. On this channel, you will find a ton of sewing content such as sew with me videos and sewing tutorials. But that's not all we talk about here at my fashion school. And if you've seen my video essays, you already know that. You should be so proud of yourself that you want to take up a new skill, especially sewing, because sewing is a dying skill.
Here are 3 jobs that are literally disappearing, and if you start them today, they'll make you a lot of money. The first one is seamstresses and tailors. How many young people do you know that really want to become a seamstress or become a tailor? It doesn't exist anymore. People that are doing it right now are making a killing. It's going to be even better in the future because no one wants to get into it. People are always going to need their clothes to be altered. I mean, could you believe that you can make hundreds of thousands of dollars with this thing right here?
I don't know about y'all, but every time I get something in the mail, it just never fits. I'm constantly tailoring my own clothes. I don't understand how people who don't know how to sew shop these days. The sizing is so off. And I swear, I read the size chart and then it comes in and I'm like, excuse me? In this video, we will be going over sewing definitions. These are the ones that I thought were the most popular or the ones that you really should know in the beginning when learning how to sew. So I most likely will be doing more of these videos because these are not all of the sewing definitions. Expanding your vocabulary in general is super important. It overall enhances your communication skills. If you're in a board meeting, if you're reading a book, if you're watching a speech, you're able to fully take in what the person is saying. It'll make life so much easier for you. Jim Rohn once said that vocabulary enables us to interpret and to express. If you have a limited vocabulary, you will also have a limited vision and a limited future. So I highly recommend implementing something into your daily routine that will help expand your vocabulary. Maybe add new words every day to flashcards and study those. Or what I use is the vocabulary app. It's just like nice and easy to just whip out your phone every day and have new words to look at. And another thing that I like about the app is that you can add your own. So when I'm reading and I don't know a word, I'll just add it into my vocabulary app right then and there so I can study it later. It's also super cute because you can change the background and there's a bunch of different like fonts and stuff that you can go with. I have ADHD, so I'm like constantly changing mine. It is only $30 for the whole year, which I think is pretty reasonable. And investing in your education is money that will never, ever be wasted. This sounds like an ad, but I swear it's not. Before we get into it, don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell button to know when I have new videos up. Like, share, comment, and don't forget to follow me on Instagram and TikTok for more fashion content and much, much more. All right, class, get out your notebooks and jot down these sewing definitions and study them throughout the week. Or what you can do is download this PDF. It contains all the sewing definitions that will be in this video, along with pictures to help you guys out. I don't know about y'all, but I'm a visual learner. I need pictures. This is completely free. I'm gonna have the link below so you can download it and put it in your sewing notebook. All right, without further ado, let's get into the sewing definitions. The first definition on our list is sewing pattern, a template made up of the shapes you need to cut out of the fabric in order to sew the garment. You can either buy sewing patterns at your local sewing shop or download them off of Etsy. I have my own sewing patterns for you guys, and I will have the link to my Etsy shop below. A good way to start understanding sewing patterns a little bit better, this is something that I love to tell beginners, take clothes that you already have in your closet and lay them flat on the ground and just start analyzing the shapes. Start with something simple like a t-shirt. Every time you see a seam in the garment is when you know that that's a separate pattern piece. Which brings me to our next definition, seam. The line where you sew together two pieces of fabric. This one's pretty easy, like I just said. Anytime you see a line in your garment, that is a seam. For example, with a shirt like mine, you have a shoulder seam here, and then right here is the side seam. And then on the sleeve, this is a underarm seam. Moving on to our next definition, seam allowance. The seam allowance is the fabric area between the raw edge of the fabric and the stitch line. The width of a seam allowance will vary depending on the project and area of the garment. Always double check your sewing pattern for the exact measurement of the seam allowance. The seam allowance is basically the extra sliver of fabric that you will see on the inside of your garment. You either can cover up your seam allowances on the inside of your garment by putting in a lining, or you can serge your seam allowances so they will look clean and professional. Now, here are some seam allowance tips. Be sure to read through your sewing pattern and mark down all the seam allowance measurements, or just be sure to check as you go through each step of sewing the garment. When cutting a sewing pattern, be aware that the dotted or solid lines are where you cut, and the seam allowance is already added into the sewing pattern. There won't be a line that shows the seam allowance. It's invisible. When you start to sew your garment, make sure you measure the distance from your needle to the edge of the raw fabric to be sure you are sewing the correct seam allowance. Our next definition is selvage edge. The edge of the fabric that is finished and won't fray. It's the narrow border that runs lengthwise. It usually says the manufacturer's name on it. The selvage edge is usually much easier to see on woven fabrics, which woven fabrics we will be getting to momentarily. If you look closely, the selvage edge will usually have teeny little holes poked in it. Now, the selvage edge and knowing where it is super important in sewing because you will need to know the correct directions of your fabric. This is called the warp and the weft, which basically just means the horizontal and the vertical directions of your fabric, which is up next on our list. There are two grain lines on your fabric, the lengthwise grain line and the crosswise grain line, and they both have names. First, let's start with the warp definition. The yarns in the fabric that are parallel to the selvage edge. Weft is the yarns in the fabric that are perpendicular to the selvage edge. The weft has more stretch than the warp. This is also why it's super important to know the directions of your fabric, because let's say we are sewing a jersey bodycon dress, right? You want the most stretch to be this way because you're gonna want it to fit to your body perfectly. If you create a dress and the most stretch is up and down, it's just not gonna come out right. Most sewing patterns should have a symbol on it, a line with two arrows. This is so that you will know which direction to place your sewing pattern on your fabric. Simply cutting your sewing pattern in the wrong direction could mess up your whole sewing project. Try stretching your fabric if you are confused on which way is warp and weft. A good way to remember warp from weft is to think of your fabric lengthwise as a long runway for planes to take off on, and the plane making a warp sound. My teacher told me this in fashion school and it helped me so much. Our next definition is bias. Bias refers to the 45-degree angle to the selvage edge. When working with woven fabric, the bias has the most stretch even when it's non-stretch fabric. Woven fabric does not stretch unless cut on the bias, or an elastic is woven into the fabric like elastane. Another fun fact about the bias is that when you cut on it, the fabric doesn't fray. It is necessary for some sewing patterns to be cut on the bias. An example of a garment that is usually cut on the bias are cowl neck tops and cowl neck dresses. Our next sewing definition is cut on fold. When a sewing pattern says you need to cut the pattern piece on the folds, it means you need to fold your fabric in half and align that edge of the pattern piece on the folded line of the fabric. Here I am cutting one of my pattern pieces on the fold. You will usually want to fold your fabric right sides together so you can add any markings from the sewing pattern and also to protect that right side of the fabric. Our next sewing definition is backstitch. The backstitch refers to when you sew backwards 2 or 3 stitches to secure the stitch at the beginning and end of your seam. This makes sure your stitch doesn't unravel. This is what the reverse button on your sewing machine is used for. Our next definition is basting stitch, a loose sewing stitch mainly used to hold layers of fabric together temporarily. You can baste by hand or use your sewing machine. You can use a basting stitch when you want to check the fit of the garment before you go in and sew the actual seam. You can see basting stitches on suits when tailors are tailoring them. Basting stitches can also be used in suit pockets to close the pocket so that it stays nice and flat and crisp, so you look super professional when you're wearing it, but you also have the option to stick your finger in there and take the basting stitch out so that you can actually utilize the pockets. Personally, when I am purchasing a blazer or a pantsuit, I always like to keep the pockets closed because I feel like that's the point of business wear, is to look super clean, super crisp, and super professional. Other reasons to use a basting stitch is to attach a zipper, sew in a sleeve, or gather fabric. Moving on to our next definition, bar tack. A bar tack is a very tight zigzag stitch used to reinforce areas on clothing that experience high stress. For example, they're used on belt loops on jeans and also on the side of jeans where your hips are. If you've ever tried to seam rip a bar tack, you know they are very, very secure. When wearing jeans, the hip area experiences the most stress because you're walking all the time, you're sitting down, you're standing up. That area is going to need a secure stitch so that none of the seams rip. Moving on to our next definition, bobbin. A small spool that goes in the bottom of your sewing machine to create the bottom thread in your stitches. Bobbins come in a lot of different sizes, so be sure to buy some that match your sewing machine. You will be needing a bunch of bobbins to match all the thread colors you have. So basically for every spool of thread you have, you're gonna need a little bobbin to go along with it. You can buy them in bulk on Amazon. But like I said, make sure you identify which bobbin you will be needing for your sewing machine before you go and buy a ton of them. Our next definition is draping. The process of pinning and sculpting the fabric on the dress form in order to create the necessary shapes for the sewing pattern you are trying to create. You can also use draping to design organically by playing with the fabric on the dress form. If you've watched my video on sewing my Catherine Pierce Halloween costume, I drape in that video, and that is how I created that dress. Draping is my favorite technique in sewing. When I started learning how to drape is when sewing patterns started to click more in my head and the shapes of clothing just make so much more sense. I really want to make videos on how to drape, so look out for this, but I highly recommend for beginners to learn how to drape because I think it's just such a wonderful technique. Moving on to our next definition, darts. Folds sewn into the fabric to create a 3-dimensional shape. They are usually shaped like triangles or diamonds. So since the human body is 3D, your sewing patterns can't just be flat shapes. We have curves, especially us women, we have bust, we have hips, we have the butt, and that is where darts come in. Moving on to our next definition, interfacing. Fabric that is sewn or ironed onto a garment to provide strength and structure to high-stress areas such as collars, cuffs, and plackets. As a general rule, anything with buttons or tailoring, so shirting, pants, suiting, requires some interfacing. The weight and style of an interfacing must be appropriate for the fabric itself. A too heavy interfacing might show through a sheer fabric, while fusible might cause puckering on a delicate silk. Our next sewing definition is facing. A facing is a small piece of fabric used to finish the raw edge of the garment. This not only finishes the edge, but adds more structure and strength to the garment. You will usually add interfacing to your facing because it will make it sturdier, especially when the fabric you are using for your garment is on the flimsier side. Facing is what I like to use when I don't feel like putting a lining into a garment or a lining is just unnecessary. It still makes the garment look clean and professional because the edges are finished, but you don't have to go through the hassle of doing a full-blown lining on the inside. The facing is usually the same fabric that is used for the outside of the garment. Most fabrics fall into one of two categories: knit fabrics and woven fabrics. Knitted fabric is a textile that results from knitting, the process of interlooping of yarns or intermeshing of loops. Knit fabric is what your tank tops and your t-shirts are made out of. Knit fabrics usually look the same on both the front and the back. You can think of knit fabrics as more casual. So like I said, think of tank tops, t-shirts, bodycon dresses that you would get at like Target or Amazon, sweatshirts. Another way to tell if a garment is made from knit or woven fabric is knit garments will rarely have darts in them because you don't need them. Since the fabric stretches, it will just mold to the body naturally, as opposed to woven fabrics. Woven fabric is any textile formed by weaving. There are lengthwise threads, which are the warp, and crosswise threads, which are the weft. Woven fabric does not stretch unless cut on the bias or an elastic is woven into the fabric like elastane. Woven fabric usually has a wrong side, which will appear slightly duller or be a slightly different color from the right side. So for woven fabrics, you can think of them as the fancier fabric. So think trousers, blazers, silk dresses, business wear, and pencil skirts. Usually garments that require more structure. Since woven fabrics have little to no stretch, you're gonna need more seams and darts so that it fits the shape of the body nicely. The third fabric category is non-wovens, also referred to in the industry as other fabric types. Non-woven fabric is any fabric formed directly from fibers or from non-fiber sources without weaving or knitting. Examples of this is felt, leather, latex, foam, and some interfacings. Felt, for example, is a kind of cloth made by rolling and pressing wool or another suitable textile accompanied by the application of moisture or heat, which causes the fibers to mat together to create a smooth surface. All right, class, that is it for this week. Thank you so much for watching and study those sewing definitions. Don't forget, I have the printable PDF for you guys that is totally free. I will have the link to download that below. And comment below what videos you would like to see next. Thank you for enrolling at my fashion school. Love you.